without further ado, oh yeah, here's the website, but I'm sure you guys have also seen the newsletter. I'd like to introduce our guest speaker. So Ron Miller is a retired pediatrician from that famous trout hotspot, North Dakota. Well, he's from Fargo, so he's pretty close.
Oh my gosh.
And the way that I met Ron is in 2019 in June, we had a big rain event down here in the Twin Cities, and I couldn't fish the driftless. And I'd heard the Straight River had some good fishing. So I just rented a trailer on Airbnb and I drove up to the Straight River. And I show up on this stream, which is not like any stream I'm familiar with in the driftless, very slow moving, flowing through some swampy ground. And I see these two guys sitting on their car, you know, kind of looking like they knew how to fish. And I said, do you guys have any hints for fishing this stream? And they said, well, the first thing you want to do is drive into Park Rapids. There's a Walmart, buy a headlamp and come back. Because the hexes are hatching and you're going to need a headlamp. And I had no idea that there were, I had fished the hex hatch before in Wisconsin, but no idea there were hex hatches on the Straight River. So I went and bought a headlamp and got into some nice trout that night. The next day I went into the DNR office in Park Rapids and met with the fisheries guy there, asked him about the Straight River, and he pulled out a Straight River hatch chart. And he said, I got this from a guy named Ron Miller because he knows everything about the Straight River. And he made this hatch chart for us. So anyway, that's how I know Ron Miller. He's been fishing the Strait for at least 30 years. I'll let him tell you. But I think that's probably enough of an introduction. And I'm sure you guys want to hear about the hex hatch. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to let Ron share his screen. I guess before I do that, a note to everybody, please put your phones on stun. And we will be collecting questions on the chat during the course of Ron's presentation. If you have a question for Ron, just go ahead and put it in the chat. Once we get through all the questions in the chat, then we'll turn it over to the in-person audience. And Ron has also said that he's willing to stay late. So if we have so many questions that it gets to be 8:30, it's okay. Ron will still hang around and answer your questions. So now I really am going to stop sharing my screen. If I can do that. And I'm going to let Ron share his screen. Are you good, Ron?
I think I'm getting there.
Oh yeah, look at that. And I am going to, what do I need to do here? I need to.
Okay, I think this slide program's up.
Yep.
And can everybody see me?
We can see the slides and we can see you a little bit in the upper corner.
Okay. And can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes, we can.
All right.
Yes.
Well, thank you for inviting me. And I hope this all works so I can tell you something more about a trout stream. To start off with, I would tell you that this is not like most trout streams. It's more like spring creeks that you see in Montana, near Livingston, Montana. If you ever fished those streams there, the spring creeks and the ranches that have them, very slow moving water, very cold water for the most part, and consequently bigger fish than you get from fast moving cold streams. So I'm going to start here. Whoops. So what's all the fuss about? This is a Hexagenia fly. They're about 35 millimeters long from nose to tail. That doesn't include the tail. That's another 10, 12 millimeters. You can see that many of these that I just photographed in a canoe probably have very yellow tinted wings, and those are duns that have just hatched. But these ones that you see that have this clear wing, that would be a classic Hexagenia spinner. You've all seen this in other mayflies, I'm sure. So you would recognize that there's both duns or sub-imago stage and spinners or imago stage. This is the kind of fish you're looking for. This fish was about 27 inches long and was feeding on a dun rise along what I call a half funnel, where watercress pushed the water out and the water came from one side, and it created a little line of duns coming down, and this bad boy was just sucking them in right and left. I'd actually probably hooked this fish and lost him the summer before during the daytime, fishing a hopper right in the same spot, and he broke me off. But then I came back to the Hex and was able to capture this fish. I normally don't take pictures because they're just too much risk to the fish. They're in warm water and don't want to do that. The Straight River is not just a Hexagenia trout stream. It has other hatches that are fairly significant, and fish can be caught on all these. I'll just run them off for you. Many of them you're familiar with, I'm sure. But Hendrickson or rusty spinners in May are pretty good. Oh, why am I having trouble with this? Hendrickson or rusty spinners are pretty good in May, and that's a action that occurs in the daytime usually on the Straight River, and it requires a cloudy day. Sulfurs come on in the late May, early June timeframe, and they're evening, kind of sundown kinds of things. A stenonema used to be called, it's called colloquially a gray fox, comes on in the evening. And hydrocycle is just a common little caddisfly that can be found and fished as well. The big guns start with the brown drakes. They're usually about a week or 10 days ahead of the Hex. Brown drakes are usually the first few days of June, first 7-10 days. And then about a week later, almost predictably, the Hexagenia start. And those go on for maybe a week to 2 weeks. In one spot, the rise of the Hexagenia is a bell-shaped curve. So it starts off with a few, reaches a peak, and dies out. The hoppers, ants, and crickets are kind of a summertime thing. Lepidostoma is another common caddisfly that the fish see a lot and can be caught. You can catch trout on trichos, but there's so many chubs that usually that's not a very worthwhile endeavor. Epheron is the white miller, which is a night fly. Epheron is a white fly. The white miller is a nectopsych, and that's in the late afternoon, early evening. Slate wing olive looks like a Baetis, but it's a little bit bigger, and that's kind of a morning thing. Golden drakes are fun when you find them because the fish will take them selectively, and they're very pretty. This used to be called potamanthus. And then the giant false sedge or pycnopsych, that's a October size caddis, if you will. And it's big, so size 8. And Baetis, you're all familiar with, is in the late fall, about the time the streams close. Let's see if I can get this to go. Yep. So the brown trout of the Straight River, this fish was caught just this last fall, actually on the last day of the season. And I did take a picture just because it was a pretty fall day and I thought the colors would show well, and they do pretty well. You may notice the size of the net. It's a good size net. So for those of you that do steelheading, you have the right size of net because the fish are big, and having a bigger net really helps capturing them in the dark. This is a typical size fish that would be caught in a nighttime hex, 14, 15 to 20 inches. Smaller ones are caught, but once the big boys are out, you don't see many 6 to 12-inch fish like you do like during a Baetis or Trico hatch and spinner fall. Everybody talks about the hex hatch, and obviously there is a hatch, but the hatch is not the piece de resistance of what you're fishing. What you really want to fish is the spinner fall. And what happens time-wise in the stream is that between 9 and 10 o'clock, some hex will hatch. And about 10 o'clock, so in June now, it's dark and it's into the still twilight, so you can still see somewhat. That's when the big ones start to come out. And when I say big, I mean 16 to 18 and above. And this is typical for the size you would catch. And it was caught on the one October caddis or pycnocyte. This would be a larger fish than average for most daytime dry fly. It just happened that water was cold. I had a shady spot where the fish could hide in the shade, and that fish just took the pycnocyte with no hesitation. Most of these fish in the Straight River have never been caught, I think. And so when you catch them, you know, it's pretty much a wild scenario, especially when it's in the dark. And even when it's in the light, you still have the disadvantages of a stream with a lot of junk in it. The first picture that Bob showed up on the corner showed some woody debris in there. That would be a spot that you would target where there's woody debris. So this is a larger fish than average during the daytime. You don't catch usually a fish this size in the tricos, or at least if you hook it, you don't land it. So what to bring? If you come, Bob will give you my email, and you can email me when you know you're coming, and I will email you back what's happening because I'm usually fishing that frequently enough that I kind of know, and suggesting where you might want to go. For the rod and reel, I use a 6 or 7 weight rod. Currently, I'm using a 10-foot 7 weight with 6 to 9 feet of 2X fluorocarbon leader and some extra 2X tippet. You want to have your rod all loaded up with a spinner before the action starts, because most of the action is going to be on spinners. The hatch itself can be very, very minimal. It can be fantastic, like it was when I caught that really big fish, but it's not the hex duns that you really are targeting. You're really targeting the spinners, and they characteristically start between 10 and 10:15. It's almost like they flip a switch. And the duns probably tend to hatch all night long. So if you were to say you don't like fishing in the dark, you don't want to be stumbling around the creek in the dark, you don't like that, you think it's maybe risky or whatever, for whatever reason, one little trick is to come early in the morning. Now, that time of year, the light comes on by 5 o'clock and you can see well enough to fish by 5 o'clock. And if you start off in the river at 5 o'clock, just fishing Hexagenia dun, parachute dun type pattern, classic parachute dun, you can catch fish pretty well because they're used to seeing these flies and they're used to seeing them hatch during the night and feeding off and on when they hatch. And this is nothing new to them to have one pop up at 5:30 in the morning. It looks realistic and it works well. If you by chance have had a storm the night before where it's really put down the hatch, it just didn't happen, they will burst the next morning sometimes. And I've hit this 2 or 3 times through the years, and it's pretty fantastic. But you have to sort of watch for it and know for it. But in any event, fishing early in the morning is a good thing because the water's colder. The fish are still looking for flies coming down, and you can oftentimes have pretty fantastic dry fly fishing where you can actually see what you're doing. You have to use a little different gear. You have to use maybe a 5 weight rod, maybe a 12-foot leader, maybe a 15-foot leader. maybe 3X rather than 2X, but you'll figure it out and you'll get it done. The red hook spinner is my favorite spinner pattern. It's tied on an asymmetric octopus red hook, size 4 or 6. And the tail is yellow deer hair. The body is foam, and the wings are white-tailed deer with sparkle in them. So there's some sparkliness. And you can have pretty flies that match perfectly what the fly tyer sees and will sell flies, or you can have ugly flies. And I have a friend who's a believer in ugly flies and always preaches about it, and I've become a convert because of this. This is an ugly fly. This is actually a Hexagenia spinner with a foamed thorax area for keeping it afloat. You can see little white wings and a little sparkle in that wing, but it's all falling apart. And the reason it's falling apart is when I retired it from service, it had caught 10 fish in one night. And so it just was in a good spot, got the fly out there in an easy way, and it come in mangled. And after the 10th fish, I said, well, the action's almost over. The fish are quieted down. I've had a great time. I'm going to retire this fly. And I didn't realize till I got it home and took a look at it, how badly mangled it was and how the last fish took it. Well, the reason they take it is because when you see a dun coming down the water, they're like these beautiful little sailboats. That's not how the spinners come down the water. They don't come down, with their wings out and their body perfectly in a cross shape. They don't come out like that at all. They're usually still alive. They're usually still moving and wiggling. And a lot of times they'll have one wing and just the thorax on the water. So they look all different. They come down like you expect, but fish sometimes key in on the motion and the wiggliness of the dying spinner. So what else to bring? Well, don't be like Bob and come without a headlight. You need a headlight, and you need a backup headlight too if you don't have a brand new one. But what else to bring? Well, the mosquitoes are intense. In the roadside, there's lots of ticks. Mosquitoes, we've had them where there's practically none and had them where they're just miserable. So I'll show you a picture later on of what I look like when I'm going to fish in the miserable mosquito time. You want waders that don't leak. The water temperature of the river will be probably 65 to 75 degrees. And that has some meaning in terms of release of fish and all that. But what it also means is that if you get in the water, your body temperature is 98, you're going to get cold if you're standing in water and not moving around. So waders that don't leak for comfort and for safety. It's good to have a canoe or a kayak and a second rod. That big fish I caught, I actually had beached the canoe right in the spot where I thought he would be. And nothing happened. The hatch was obviously on. I put my light on the water to check it out. I was seeing all these duns coming down, and I could hear fish just a little bit upstream feeding. So I said, well, not tonight for the big guy. And took my best rod, my favorite rod at that time, a 9.5 foot, 6-7 weight powell rod. And I went upstream, and I promptly got all tangled up in the trees. I had to break it off, but I had a second rod loaded back in the canoe. So I went back to the canoe, just probably 30 feet away, 25, 30 feet away, quietly, put the rod down, broke it down, just laid it in the canoe so it'd be safe. And then I could hear this fish feeding. And I said, oh, that's the big guy. That was that big guy. And so I had a second rod loaded with a spinner, and he took the spinner rather than the dun because I didn't want to change flies. You don't know how long the action's going to last. So a second rod is a good idea, but you got to have a canoe or kayak to do it. I recommend having a little food along. I like Snickers and I like Snickerdoodle cookies. Beer is also very good on a hot night, but you're going to have to pee probably. So be aware of that. You cannot walk along the river. This river does not have fishermen's paths along the river. For those of you that have fished the Brule in Wisconsin, which I did a couple of years ago, there's fisherman's path up and down the river everywhere. There's nothing like this. You're fishing in a swamp. you're fishing in a swamp where there are springs that produce cold water, but it's a swamp. And hiking through cattails is something you do not want to have to do a lot of, especially in the dark. It's okay in the light if you have to do it to get around a deep hole or something in the river. And there are occasional ones like that. But basically, you can't walk along the river. There's not a fisherman's path. You're wading in the river. I recommend, as a physician, recommending protective eyewear, polycarbonate type lenses. And if you're older like I am, you want cheaters so you can get them large. But I can almost put a hex through a number 6 2X without cheaters. They're that big. But you do have to have a headlight. If you can't get the light on the system, you're not going to get a new fly tied on if you happen to lose an old one. Rain jacket is good if it's looking for rain. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Fleece, if you're getting cool, and oftentimes the water temperature is 65, 70 degrees, and it'll very quickly drop even in mid-June to 50, 55. And you might want some kind of warmth at that point in time. I fish with a love them or leave them mentality. If I catch them, I catch them, and if I don't, I don't. But I don't prolong the fish with lots of photographs, although I will show you how you want to do it in an upcoming slide. So this is me having fished in September. I took my cousin fishing, and he took the photograph. It's an old photograph. But we ran into a spinner fall of caddis that was unbelievable. We had some pretty remarkable fishing. You can see it's a little cloudy, but it was about 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and we just ran into this place where they were and hit the jackpot on a September fishing expedition, which I would highly recommend because there's just nobody else around. Really, there's a couple guys that fish, and that's about it, besides me. So when to come? June 10th to June 20th is pretty consistent, but I offer my email for those of you that are seriously wanting to come. The hex activity, as I mentioned, starts on a bell-shaped curve. I once in 1990, as a learning experience, went to the same pool run corner every night for like 9 out of 12 nights. And knew I normally would have moved up, but I wanted to see what happened, and that's what happened. The hex started hatching. You could hardly notice them. There were no fish feeding on the first night or two, but I knew this was a great place because we'd run into it before, and we call it the fish factory pool, and it is a factory of fish there, all kinds of habitat. And so we were there. I was there with my brother-in-law actually, and he went on fishing, and I mostly sort of studied the situation because I wanted to know what would it be like. So I had my light on the water a lot, and I could see every night what happened. And what happened is the first 2 or 3 nights there were hex duns hatching, maybe an occasional fish fed, but didn't catch anything. Then they started to get into them. And then there were 2 or 3 nights where there were just total blanket spinner falls. I'll talk a little bit more about what that is. And then the hatch type activity stopped. And slowly but surely, the spinner falls wound down, and then they were over. So that's the bell-shaped curve. I already said duns versus spinners. If you tie on one fly, you want to have a spinner pattern, something that has white wings with some sparkle in it, has a foamed thorax for flotation, can have a little hackle if you want, something like deer hair or elk hair dyed yellow, and tails are not important. And that's the type of spinner pattern you want to have. The parachute duns are fine if they're really keying on Hexagenia duns, but if they're not, most of the feeding you're going to see is going to be on spinners. So the duns in the emergence are not that important. The spinners are supreme. And by 10 o'clock, 10:05, the dark of the moon, it'll start earlier. And if the moon is not up, it'll start a little later. And you want to be someplace where you're going to fish by about 9 o'clock, maybe earlier. The reason is twofold. One, it's a courtesy to other fishermen. you don't want to show up at some spot and pull in at 10 of 10 where you've had to cross the pass and the runs of people that have been there since 7 o'clock. And you also want to be there because you want to see what the water flows are like. If you cast here, you know, at 9 o'clock or 8 o'clock, you're probably not going to catch a fish, but you want to see what happens to your fly line and your leaders and how much drag you have. And so you get that figured out while it's light, because you can't figure it out in the dark usually. So this is what it looks like when things are starting. And this is a great little place here. This is DNR work or tree drop work on the left here. And you can see the rod pointing basically to the sun. And this far bank over here, so it'd be the left bank upstream there. The water's flowing from left to right. And the left bank is the far bank there. And that's a deep cut along cattails and fast. And there's a lot of muck. On the right bank is a lot of muck. And this tends to be a half funnel. And then it pushes the fish down here to the middle, just to the right of where the rod is. And so these fish can set in 70-degree water, which big brown trout are pretty comfortable with. And they can set in about 2 feet of water that slows down coming out of this little run, because it's like a little pool. It's like a little run, then a little pool. And they're in there in numbers. And then to the right is an undercut bank. Again, it's on the left bank, going downstream is to the right. But this is hex hatch time. This is witching hour. This is what things look like when you're fighting a lot of mosquitoes. You got a permethrin treated shirt, permethrin treated headgear, a newer battery replaced nice nightlight, protective lenses. I'm ready. So where to fish? Well, you're going to fish in the water, right? The lesson you teach everybody, if the fly is not in the water, you're not going to catch any fish. So that's what every teacher tells. And what happens I've seen in beginners, and I don't think most of you who do a lot of fishing would run into this, but people are just beginners to fly fishing. They don't realize they're tangled and keep on casting. When you're tangled, you get a geometric progression of problems. So one thing to do is to practice. Any bend is good once the hex is on. So there's going to be fish on every bend. And I've had guys come up to me and say, I like to fish there because I hooked this big fish last night. I'll say, fine, I'll go down a half a bend where I know there's just as many or more fish. And a friend of mine is even better about this than I have. It's a little irritating at times, the way people ask. But he said, oh, sure, you can. So he goes on to catch a 21, 22-inch fish, and the guy who took the great spot is now blanked. So all spots are good, and all those big brown trout that live down deep in spring holes, they're coming up and they're in a foot of water taking off the spinner falls. So we look for spinner flats. That's where the water comes fast. There's mud banks along one side or both. And then it opens up into a kind of a flat, slow moving area. And that big trout can just sit in that and just rise up and rise up and rise up. Deep holes are still good. Sometimes they're where fish have to feed if the water's too warm. And funnels or half funnels are just as I described. Blanket spinner falls occur a lot. And what that is when you hear a fish feeding, you're kind of casting, you maybe catch a fish, and then all of a sudden you hear all this feeding and nobody's taking your fly anymore. You've got two nice fish, but nobody's taking your fly. You wonder what's going on. What you do is you turn on your headlight and look. Always, if you have trouble, turn on the headlight and look. Once you shut it off, it'll take about 15 to 30 seconds for that trout to forget about it. And the blanket spinner falls are killers because you catch a fish maybe at the start, maybe two, then you get nothing because there's so many flies on the water. Your flies looks just as good as the ones that are coming down, and you can cast it up a little bit and check it coming down, and you can see, my gosh, it looks just perfect. And it is, but it's not going to be, getting in the race when there's 100 other naturals coming down. So you kind of tend to have to wait and be patient and maybe listen carefully, targeting a bigger fish. And then when you think the spinner fall is dying down, you hope that fish is still feeding and you cast to that fish alone. And that's how you fish a blanket hatch. You get a fish at the start, maybe, and you get a fish or two at the end, maybe, but it's hard when you have that big a blanket spinner fall. As I said, there's no bank fishing, except you can wade through to a spot where there's like solid ground and maybe some cattails and grass, and you can maybe work out where to stand up and fit, so you don't have to stand in the water. And that's kind of nice because you can, do things a little bit better, but you need a short leader. You don't want it too long, 6-7 feet. And you can sort of see where they are, hear where they are, and you can get a cast that goes around a corner, gives you a lot of opportunity. This is a dun. You can see the yellowness is still in the wings. I called it a spinner, but I decided it's probably more like a dun. Hard to tell sometimes. It could be a spinner, I guess. How to be ready? Practice at home in the dark. Can't tell you how important this is. If you can learn to practice in the dark without tangling, you're going to catch good fish. Decipher and triangulate. That means try to figure out where the big fish is feeding. Get in close. This is not a beautiful casting scenario. Some of the best hex fishermen cannot cast all that well. They are very poor casters, but they are good waders and they are good dappers, and they dap that hex fly right in front of the nose of that big trout and they catch them. So take a look with your light if you have to. Casts are short. You have to, drag is your enemy. But if you're fishing an emerger pattern like a cone, if you cast it up and it goes by you and goes down and you let it swing, it sort of produces a swing effect. And I've had some big fish clobber it, I guess thinking it was a hatching dun that was getting away, but just clobber it kind of activity. But that doesn't happen too often. It's good when you're done to get the road report. The road report is when everybody meets at 5 Mile, which is the Becker-Hubbard County line. And everybody reports about how they caught, what fish they caught, what it was like. Did they have flies? Did they not have flies? It's pretty much the golden rule. If you have flies, you catch fish. If you don't have many flies, it's tough to catch fish. Here's a friend of mine from Bemidji. He's a longtime True U guy. And you can see he's got this fish. It's about 26 inches long. He was fishing with a buddy, and the buddy took the picture and he let the fish go. You can see back near the tail on the fish a wound, probably from a heron. And it hasn't healed up ever, really. Anyhow, this is what you have to do. So it's a challenge. I would challenge that it's probably, if you catch a big fish on the Straight River, it's probably going to be the biggest fish you'll catch in Minnesota. The hex hatch is so important nutritionally, metabolically to fish that they may put on half of their weight gain, a third of their weight gain just from the hex hatch. Because you have a piece of steak coming down that you're gobbling up, and you're doing it not just for one night, but you're doing it night after night after night. And these fish will move around a little bit. They just seem to know if the spinner fall is upstream, that's where I want to be. If the spinner fall is downstream, that's where I want to be. So they get into position, and the big ones only grow bigger. So once you get to be 16, 17 inches, you're not taking tricos much anymore. You're not feeding on anything but mice, crayfish, hex, and minnows. That's what the big brown trout want, is those 16, 17 inch fish and bigger. That's what they're looking for. They're looking for big meat. And to prove that you can do it your first night, this is my son-in-law, who's fished a lot. So he knows how to fish. He hasn't done much fly fishing, but we took him out, put him on a good spot called the Dead Beaver Bend, and he caught this really beautiful brown trout that was about 18, 19 inches long. And it's the first trout he ever caught. But you can see he's a pretty happy camper. So what are the dangers of hex fishing? There are 4. Human vehicular accidents. You have to be careful when you're driving around rural Minnesota at night because of the problems with drunk driving. You have to be careful for deer. I hit a deer 3-4 years ago, $5,000 worth of damage to the front of my Land Cruiser. You have to be a little suspicious about bats. There aren't as many bats as there used to be, but you can catch bats at night, and it's always the same scenario when you talk to people what happened, and it's how I caught a brown bat. I was blind casting in a wide area of stream where I could hear fish feeding on spinners in front of me, just occasionally. And as I went to make the back cast, something took it. Well, there's nothing behind me for 40 yards but river and no trees or bushes. So I knew a bat had taken it, and I just cut him off and let him loose. He probably downed, but if you get bit by the bat, you better go and get rabies shots. So it's just better not to catch him if you can help it. But fortunately, I've only seen 2 caught between I and my friend in all the years we fished. And lightning. There's a lot of storms out there, and there's not much cover. But you don't really want tall tree cover. You want marsh cover. You want to be low down. And I just don't fish anymore if the weather's not right for it. It's just not worth getting struck by lightning. So there's my email. For those of you that are aficionados of fine fly fishing equipment, you'll know what a Serrazione is. And when it sings, you might be aware of what that is. So I'm happy to answer any questions, go into more detail about anything, hex or otherwise. So I'll stay on the screen, huh?
Yep, just stay on. You can keep, you might want to keep your presentation up, Ron, because you might need to refer to a slide. So everybody, I see there are already a few questions on the chat, and please feel free to add questions, and I'm gonna start asking the questions. Before I do, I should mention, I forgot one thing, and that is that everybody that signed up for this meeting tonight will be put into a drawing for a box of 48 flies tied by Paul Johnson. All of them are size 14 and smaller. So maybe not the best things for the hex hatch on the straight, but they are beautiful flies. If you were at the expo, you probably saw Paul tying. So I just wanted to let you know that. So anyway, I'm going to start, Ron. The first question is from Jim Souter, and his question is whether there are vendors that rent canoes in the area.
I don't know, but I don't think so. You'd probably be better off getting a canoe in the cities and bringing it up yourself. I don't think, never run across anybody. I mean, we've been living down there most of the summer for the past several years, and off and on all spring, summer, and fall for 25, 30 years. And I don't remember there being anybody who's renting canoes. You don't have to have a canoe.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Ron. I've changed my mind. I'm going to stop your share so that people can see you better. We can always put your slide back up if we need to.
Okay. So you
keep going. Sorry.
Yeah, you don't need a canoe. You can wade the river. It can be a little tough a couple places, but probably do it. The people, if you go to 5 Mile, which is the Becker-Hubbard County line, downstream for quite a ways, there's good fishing. And upstream for a long ways, there's good fishing. Most of the people like me and my friends with canoes, we go a ways away. So wading fishermen can fish the first 2 or 3 bends below or above the road. And that's pretty much what happens. You don't need a big spot if the hatch is really on, if the spinners are really on. You just need about 20 yards of river and a bend. It's just, you can do it without a canoe. And then if you decide you like it, you can invest in a canoe.
Yeah, I should mention that that time that I went up, I didn't have a canoe. I think I was on 5 Mile and I did exactly what Ron said. They told me to go downstream a couple of bends, and it's still light when you're going in, so you can, kind of either wade downstream or cut through the swamp. And then on the way back, you have to wade upstream, but you can turn your headlight on and you can find your way back. The next question I think is related, Ron. This is from Mary Lilly, and she's wondering if the stream bottom is firm or soft.
Where you would wade would mostly be pretty firm. The side, especially like an inside curve, can be pretty soggy, and you wouldn't want to wade there. But where I wade the stream bottom. And for the other reason is there's less brush. So, but you have to wade carefully. If you're not used to wading in the dark, you want to have a wading staff, just as sort of a, safety thing. It's mostly wade hard. And then a lot of places you can get out of the river and stand on solid bottom. So there's a place I called the hidden hole, and it's just upstream a little ways. It doesn't look like much, but it holds really big fish because it's really deep and there's a spring comes in there. And there's like a little platform you can cast from. It's just made for a beginner. And I've taken a number of people there who are real beginners and let them fish that place, and I would go up or down for them. Downstream, there's several bends which are like that, but there's 2 or 3 down there that are a ways down that are really solid bends, and you can really, count on them being not boggy kind of thing. There are boggy things in there, boggy places, but not normally.
Okay, the next question is from some guy named Paul Johnson, and he wants to know who would have an ugly fly in their box.
Good question. Well, they don't start off ugly. My spinners usually look pretty good when they're initially tied on, but they can get ugly pretty fast. The cone fly I didn't mention, which I really want to do mention. You'll see these parachute duns. They're tied just perfectly, and they work. But the best fly for an emerger is not a beautifully tied emerger you can buy out of a catalog, but it's called a cone fly. And it's a design of Gary LaFontaine. And very simply, it has a tail of a shuck, something like Zelon or something like that. You tie in a little foam rubber at the back. You tie the body over the shank with some yellow material to look like a yellow body. You bring the foam up over the back and then tie it on and just leave a little cocked up head on it. And then you put a little hackle right around there. It's a very simple, easy fly to tie, and it's just deadly for fish that are feeding on emergers or duns. Better than the classic beautiful flies. And I love beautiful flies. I have collections of salmon flies and other flies tied by Lee Wolf, Gary Borger, just because I like that stuff.
Well, we're going to have to get you a couple of Paul Johnson flies. Who knows? We'll put your name in the lottery. Maybe you'll get lucky, Ron.
There you go. I'll tell you what happened the last time I was at a 2U lottery, and there was something to be given away. It was up in Bemidji. So one of the Bemidji guys had built this beautiful 4-weight rod. I mean, was it gorgeous? And there's a handful of people there. I mean, so everybody bought a ticket. I bought 30 tickets. Because I wanted that rod so bad. And then, the ticket was $5. I didn't win. I don't know what I'll do if 40 people put in rods. Other questions about, it's a different kind of fishing. I have a friend who's fished all over the world. He guided in Alaska for a couple summers. He guided and fished in New Zealand. He's fished for saltwater fish like permit, bonefish, tarpon. He's fished Atlantic salmon. The only fishing trip I think I've ever taken that he hasn't taken is I went to Kamchatka, Russia and fished. I don't think he's done that, but he's just done everything else. And he will tell me almost inevitably when we're talking. The straight river, it's still the hardest river to fish I've ever been on. Well, couple clues right away. Don't go in the middle of the day. It can work if it's cloudy, but don't go in the middle of the day. Fish early morning when it's hot in the summer because the water cools down, and fish in the evening in the spring and up to the hex because that's when the action is with the things. And so I don't fish many nymphs at all because there's brush in the stream and you catch them. I don't fish nymphs. I fish streamers that I can control, and I do that early in April and May. And then the rest of the summer, it's dry fly fishing. How well can you present a dry fly to a trout that's looking for hoppers, beetles, ants, and whatever?
Okay, here's a question from Mike Grangs. If you're fishing with a canoe, how do you get out of the river when you want to if other people are fishing?
Well, if you're fishing, if you have a canoe, the canoe is not for fishing. The canoe is for travel. So you're using the canoe to move up the river, down the river. You're getting up to a spot where there's nobody else, so you have a nice place for yourself, or you can share it with your partner. And then you just have an anchor on the canoe, throw the anchor up on the grass. Canoe just sits there. You fish. When you're all done fishing, you turn on your light, you put your rod away safely. You get in the canoe and you paddle out. So it's a mode of it's a vehicle of transportation to get into spots that aren't very easily reached. I mean, there's a section from 5 Mile to 7 Mile where there's practically no access except coming up or downstream on a canoe. So that's what I would say. But again, you can walk in from 5 Mile, you can walk in from 7 Mile, you can walk in from 9 Mile. If you're going to 7 Mile to fish, you want to go upstream. If you're going to 9 Mile, you want to go downstream or upstream. The largest numbers of fish consistently are from the lake to 9 Mile, which is right at Osage. And that's because that's where the DNR has put a lot of work and improvements. So, but it's a short section to fish, but it's got fish in it and it's easy to wade.
Yeah.
There's
there's a follow-up question from Mike Grangs. Mike, do you want to turn your microphone on and ask the question? I think, Ron, that maybe the question he's trying to ask about canoes is not quite getting there.
Sure.
Mike, if you can hear me, Mike, go ahead and turn your speaker on and talk. If not, I'll let you guys email or communicate some other way.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, there you go. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, what I meant was, so even if you're walking or wading the river or with a canoe, let's say I want to leave at midnight, but there's a whole bunch of other people still fishing around me that are still fishing. How do you get out of the river without, literally walking right down the middle of the river past them?
Okay, pretty much it's illegal to fish after 11 o'clock at night in Minnesota. And I think all of us do it, but almost always the time that the really action is going on is from 10-ish to 11-ish. So even without a law, the fishing usually quiets down. I mean, there's some fish feeding off and on all night long. So after 11 o'clock, you get in your canoe and you just paddle by somebody who wants to fish into into midnight. And they won't complain. What people will complain about is if you get up there, nothing happens and you're there at 10:30 and you decide you want to go home, then if you pass by somebody going downstream or going upstream, that people will be upset because, then you have to just wait. But usually if you're there at the right time of year, there's enough action on any run or any bend or any hole, if you will, that you're going to be there till 11 o'clock or whatever. And I don't look at my watch or have an alarm go off when it turns 11 o'clock. But as it turns out, a lot of times the action's done. The spinner fall is over and the fish have fattened up and fed up and they'll feed off and on all night, but most of the action is done. So that's what you do.
All right, great, thanks. Makes sense.
Okay, Ron, there's a couple of questions. One from Mary Lily asking where the hidden hole is, and I'll let you maybe email that to her. If you're feeling generous, I could connect you guys. But can you
Well,
explain about the whole 7 mile, 9 mile, 5 mile thing, what
Yeah.
that means?
So in Osage, there's a road that goes a blacktop that goes south that crosses the river, and that's about 9 miles from Park Rapids. Then 2 miles to the east towards Park Rapids, there's another road called 7 Mile. And 2 more miles, there's another road called 5 Mile, but that's also the Becker-Hubbard County line. Becker's to the west, Hubbard's to the east. There's also a crossing at 3 Mile, 2 Mile, 1 Mile. Those have less fish and more difficult wading, but there's still trout in there. And it's worthwhile if you're up on June 5th. It's going to be not much happening up at 5 Mile or 7 Mile, but it could be there. And there are some people who use those exclusively just because nobody else is around. But so few people come to fish the Hex. I mean, it's not a real popular place. It'll look busy when there's 5 cars there, but when you see all the room of river to fish, it's like miles of river. I was fishing a bend one night we call a Dead Beaver Bend. And this guy came downstream, and he could see that I was going to fish a funnel. I knew where it was. I wanted to fish it. And I think he wanted to fish it. And so he keeps sneaking downstream, kind of crowding my spot. Finally, I said to the guy, look, if you want to fish here, get out, come around where I am, because that's where you're going to catch him going upstream. And I'll just move down a half a bend, and I'll be just as happy. And so he did, but sort of discourteous in a way. I was going to tell you one other thing about technique of fishing the river. If you can find a bend, like the Mystery Bend or the Dead Beaver Bend or the Alligator Bend or whatever, if you can find one where you can cast straight across and 1 foot up in front of a rising trout, that's about right. Because remember, the current at the far bank is slower than in the middle. The thalweg is kind of a foot or two off the bank and faster, and it creates drag. So if you can figure this out in the daytime, that you can cast about a foot up, and you're going to be able to work that fly down. You're going to work it down. And so you're going to keep an arc radius of maybe 3 feet there. And you can do that all the way around. You're going to be in the money. If you have to cast upstream, like you would classic upstream dry fly fishing, you have to cast upstream. You can't line the fish, spook them when you think whatever, or downstream. It's almost better to cast downstream. If you're familiar with a parachute cast, get the fly up in the air, hold it back, lay it down, and then feed the rod and the line down. I think it's called a parachute cast. That works really well for a fish that starts rising below you and right on line with you. But if you can get that kind of arc angle swing, that's really helpful. One other thing about fishing the Straight River, I said these are wild fish. Many of them have never been caught, because if they get caught in the early season, a lot of times they're killed, so they're out of the equation. The fly fishermen let everything go, but you're catching 2, 3, 4 fish a night for half a dozen nights all over the river. A lot of these fish never been touched. They don't take a fly suspiciously. So when you watch them in the daytime, they come up and they rise and they take it. And if when you see the bubble or even hear it and you set the hook, big mouth fish, not going to miss an 8-incher or a 12-incher, but you're going to miss the big mouth guys because you'll pull it right out. Taking a lot of people fishing who actually were good fly casters, and that was the hardest thing for almost all of them to do. They're used to fishing Montana, where if you get a tickle on your fly, you set the hook. Or if you're nymph fishing with a rig, get a tickle on the rig, set the hook. Doesn't work. Better off you be slow. And when I say slow, I don't set the hook when I can see a big fish take my fly in the early, in the dusk, till I feel it. Then I set the hook. If you've done steelhead fishing, you know what I'm talking about. You want to feel the weight of the fish before you set the hook. because the big ones, you'll pull it right out. I had a guy that eventually caught 17 fish one day. We fished all day, started below 5 Mile, worked all our way upstream. And the hardest thing for him to learn, because he'd done a lot of trout fishing in Montana, was to wait to set the hook. Because if you set it too quick, it just pulls out of the big fish.
Okay, I don't have any other questions in the chat. Do we have any questions from the studio audience?
I explained everything perfectly, I hope.
Could you talk about streamers a little bit on?
Ron, the question is, could you talk a little bit about fishing streamers?
Yeah. Streamers work really well for big fish early in the season and up until into June. Once you're into late June, early July, there's a lot of moss and scum and stuff that comes on the water. And fishing streamers until fall, when that goes away, is a nightmare. So it doesn't work during most of July and August and early September. You're better off with dry flies kind of fishing. But during the early season, you can use weighted streamers, something like a cone-headed muddler, something that gets down quick, and you can swim through various habitat. So you want it 20, 30 feet in front of you, probably a 1X or odd X leader, 6-7 foot, cast it upstream, strip it downstream, look at like a bait fish getting away, whatever. And you'll get some big fish. I mean, 20+ inch fish. All my friends, every year, one person gets a big fish like that. I've caught a couple in the 22, 24 inch range doing that over the past 5 years. Good fly color in the spring is white. Are you familiar with the zoo cougar?
Yeah.
Streamer from Kelly Gallup?
Right.
Yes, he is.
Zoo cougars in white are really good. You have to use a little sink tip kind of system or something though, so they stay down, but they don't have to go down very far. Because remember, a brown trout comes up, it comes up on the streamer coming through. It doesn't clobber it from above. It comes up on it usually. And so they'll come out of a 5 foot deep hole to smash a fly that's just 2 feet below the water line. And that's not enough to get you hung up and caught on everything. If you start getting your streamer down 3-4 feet, you're going to catch every bush in the stream, and you don't want that.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Ron, could you talk just a little bit about the water temperature and whether you feel there are threats to the Straight River, or whether you think that, it's going to remain a viable fishery?
Sure. Well, whether it remains a viable fishery or not is up for grabs. The river has managed to survive for 20 years on dewatering from agricultural purposes. The trout have learned to adapt to fairly warm water. And so if you get in the June, July timeframe, water temperatures up in the 75 to 80 range, the fish just go away. They all get in some deep spring hole, and there's quite a few of them along the river, and they survive there. I suspect the 8-inch fish get eaten by the 25-inch fish, but they're trying to share a bedroom. But and the spring creeks are pretty heavy flow, so they've managed to keep cold enough water. And I've been worried about this for 15 years and still doing okay. Global warming is a huge existential threat to all trout streams, and especially to this one. The Hexagenia wiggler nymphs, which you have some there to look at, I understand, they oftentimes inhabit warm water fisheries. That's where they are. They're not really a cold water fly like a stonefly. They're a warm water fishery. And so they sort of set between cold water and some types of nymphs and warm water. And so it's a threat. Hopefully we don't get much support from the DNR up here, and TU is small. I mean, the Bemidji chapter is maybe 12, 15 people. And unfortunately, I don't live in Bemidji, so I get to very few of the meetings. But I keep in touch with a couple guys that are active in the chapter and hear what they have to say. And there's been a lot of nice helicopter tree drop stream work, which has really expanded the range of good water, because the helicopter tree drops take an area that's maybe 30 feet wide and a foot deep or less and turn it into an area that's 6 foot wide and 4 foot deep. When you get down to that 3-4 foot mark, you're usually in cold water. Some places you can hear springs coming in, and you can always see the iron oxide oftentimes coming in. And if you see watercress, dollars to donuts, there's a spring. And you'll find fish in the summer hiding under watercress because it's cool and they're in the shade. And brown trout, as you all know, love cover over their head. They like to live under a covered bridge.
Excellent.
So we're very worried about, warming of water. And that even goes true for the lakes up here, because, we have smallmouth bass and pike, and warmer water doesn't do them any good.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Okay, well, there was one comment from Bill E. Stating that Park Rapids and Bemidji Area Fisheries Office have excellent maps of area trout streams, and they're on the MDNR website. So there's another place where you can go to look for maps if you're interested. For those of you who are here, Ron mentioned this, but we have Dean Hansen who's joined us this evening. If you were at the expo, you might have seen he's an entomologist, and he has had a mayfly nymph exhibition, and he's brought some hex wigglers along. So feel free to have a look at those. Everybody that dialed in by Zoom, thank you for attending. Thanks for dealing with the technical difficulties at the beginning of the presentation. Ron, we're getting lots of people saying thank you. I think it was just a terrific presentation, and let's give Ron a round of applause. All right, well, thanks again, and we will do that lottery for those Paul Johnson trout flies. Buy some gear, donate for the Kinney. There are no hexes there. It's too cold, but it's still a great stream. And we will be sending, we'll see you maybe at the Habitat event on Saturday, and we'll see you at our next chapter meeting, and we'll be sure we sort out Zoom by then. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you, Ron.
Thank you, Bob.
Great.